Paradox games are suffering from a curse, and it's the curse of expectation. Or maybe we should call it wrongful expectation? Europa Universalis 5 is very likely, in fact it's almost guaranteed to be right around the corner. Give it about a year to a year and a half, I'd reckon, and if there's one game that's going to be impossible to follow up on, it has to be EU4. But let's take something more concrete, like Crusader Kings 3, which after 4 years of post-launch development has yet to include some of the most beloved features from CK2. But should it have? Or what about Victoria 3, which is nearing its year-and-a-half anniversary and marked the grand refresh of arguably the most forgotten Paradox series ever? I mean, Victoria 2 was actually never that popular, guys, and I realize people might own it on disc outside of Steam, but still, what we have here, even today after more than a year of updates, is a game that is highly controversial within the Paradox community, and has been so since the dev diaries themselves. Accusations were flung, charging the game with the crime of being unfinished at launch, and blaming Paradox itself for releasing a half-baked version of something they instead will make the players pay to see finished, by selling them DLC that patches up the game in the future. But are these accusations fair? Not just for Victoria 3, but for CK3, for Hearts of Iron 4, for Imperator Rome even? And will they be true for EU5? If we look at previous Paradox titles, do the accusations make sense? The Paradox curse is the condition of expecting much more than what you get on launch day, and being angry when you're not getting what you expected. When expectations aren't met, it's understandable to be frustrated, but the question remains, are expectations too high? And if so, why? Take EU4, perhaps the most content-rich Paradox game ever. Today, we know it as that all-encompassing early modern map painter, with deep, engaging content all over the world and throughout every age. But the game has been out for over 10 years. And back in 2013, there was no true religious war mechanic, no institutions that emerge over time, no new eras with unique mechanics, no proper Holy Roman Empire mechanics, no internal institutions, no mission trees whatsoever, no proper Orthodox mechanic, or unique features for Islamic or other religions, no Chinese Mandate of Heaven mechanic, and so on and so forth into infinity. Crusader Kings 2, arguably just as rich and amazing as EU4, saw 8 years of updates. At launch, there was no Charlemagne start date, no Viking Age start date, no religious orders to join, no true character focuses, no factions to join, no retinues, no plagues or prosperity. You couldn't even play as republics or Muslims, much less flavor for every nation, less map on the screen, and again, so on and so forth. And don't get me started on Hearts of Iron 4 or, oh my god, Stellaris, the latter which has just completely changed as a game up to many times. My point here is that if you love any of these games, which you really should since they are fantastic games, and you went back to not just the day of their release, but their first year of release, you would not have recognized your game, and would probably feel like an entire game's worth of content was missing. Rather than just make a new game, patch it, and dump it, like many video game companies do, Paradox actually maintains their games for years on end. Not to push random consumable microtransactions, but to actually improve the core gameplay experience that fundamentally enhances the experience over time. It's of course legitimate and valid to see it as too costly to pay for possibly hundreds of euros worth of content after almost a decade of updates. But remember that these are often on massive sales. And importantly, this is the alternative to constantly paying for full-priced new games every other year. Of course, after 10 years of updates, you and me both have grown accustomed to a certain standard. Your game, the one you've been playing since America was a somewhat functioning democracy, is filled to the brim with juicy content now. And then the new game comes out. It might look better and more flashy, but it's lacking X amount of content. It doesn't work in department Y. And before you know it, you're disillusioned with this new game that from any other company would maybe have seemed amazing and massive. In Victoria 3's case, what we have here is a game that by any standard has overall amazing foundations. I mean, think about it. At launch, you could play any centralized state in the world. Each state came with its own unique set of laws, largely according to the historical circumstance of that state. Some countries in particular came with unique flavor events that show their unique position during this time period, like that of the Ottoman Empire or the United States, two of the states with the most volatile or unique positions during this time. But every other country is also made unique by the demographic makeup of their nations, their interest groups, and laws. Due to its many mechanics, it's a game you could spend hundreds of hours in and enjoy and love. And let's not forget about the availability and support of modders, who make Paradox games even more replayable from pretty much day one. but you are likely to come across faults and issues and bugs, and even setbacks or just pure misguided game design. And this is where we can actually talk about Paradox's shortcomings. Paradox games tend to ship with a ton of bugs or unoptimized UI aspects, and obviously these are important because the entire game revolves around the UI. If something doesn't work here, or if a system doesn't work the way it should, you notice this right away, and the entire game can feel like it's not working. Honestly, I really enjoyed Victoria 3's launch, but as the community found and something both I and the game's biggest fans knew, was that the game was shipped in a state it should not have, and I won't deny that at launch, the game felt pretty much like an early access title, despite all of its content. But even this is not out of the norm for Paradox games, believe it or not, and is not exclusive to their modern games. Any other game in the series, with CK3 probably being the least buggy here, have felt like they could have needed a few more months of polishing. And honestly, if Paradox had just spent another month or three testing and fixing Victoria, it would have made it feel very different. With games as large and complex as these are, it's understandable that not everything is caught or found before launch. But Paradox need to invest more into early game testing, needs to spend more time on bug fixing and optimization before launch, so that people feel that their games are actually ready to be played, without knowing for sure they'll encounter heaps of moments where they wonder what is going on. In the case of Victoria 3, that game had a lot of UI issues in its first full year, with missing information or too convoluted windows or other issues. And when you add it all up, enough issues and too little content, well, that combination can be a real detriment to your game's chances of survival. In the case of Victoria 3, it was possible to see straight away that everyone felt the same about the game's UI, seeing as UI fixing mods popped up on Steam Workshop almost instantly. For now, Victoria 3 is alive, and I feel like it's shaping up to be one of Paradox's best games ever. But not every grand strategy game is that lucky. Imperator Rome was admittedly patched up and has become one of my favorite Paradox games, but the way it was shipped, the way its launch was handled, and its state on launch, it's hard to come back from that. Enough players were dissuaded and so disappointed with their first meeting with that game that they just never came back, and were too skeptic or just plain disinterested to pick it up and try it out again when its true condition was revealed a long 2 years later. Imperator's fate is tragic, and Paradox must understand that the launch state of a game is crucial, and hopefully they have, since Johan has already taken the conversation to the players on the Paradox forums, and that is certainly very welcoming. Now, this is obviously a different thing than asking for a feature-complete game on launch. There is no such thing as a feature-complete Paradox game unless the game is no longer being worked on, which is evident from every other one of their games. But I do believe the fans and newcomers are owed a game that at least works, that has been optimized for launch. And honestly, one that, despite perhaps not featuring everything from the past game in the series, offers something that used to be impossible, something that's enough to forgive what's missing, because you suddenly cannot go back to that old design. And this of course goes for any game out there, but it sadly is a trend these days that games need patching before reaching a stable level. I believe the Paradox curse is a real thing. For after close to a decade of development and polish, there is just no way that a new game can compete with the old in every aspect, especially if it is a direct sequel on a new engine. That's partially why I still prefer Crusader Kings 2 over Crusader Kings 3 even today, although I feel like CK3 is finally offering enough revolutionary features to stand on its own outright. But I was surprised by the response to Victoria 3. There's no doubt Victoria 2 has its fanbase and regular players, people who simply wanted a Victoria 2 with better graphics. But if you go back and play Victoria 2, at least in my humble opinion, it really feels like an outdated game. Despite coming out just 2 years before Crusader Kings 2, it feels 10 years older. Victoria 2 just didn't have that exciting gameplay flow of the later games, and it did not receive the continuous care over the course of years to achieve it. Love the game if you want to, I know I love it, but it's just nowhere near the quality level of a CK2 or EU4. Victoria 3 is, especially now after more than a year, and hopefully even more so when Spheres of Influence arrives very soon, much more engaging and feature-rich than Victoria 2 ever was, no matter how many newspaper bulletins you toss in my face. Disagreeing with how a feature works is of course a separate thing, and luckily, Paradox did to a large extent listen to the community concerning Warfare, and I'm so glad they did, and it just proves that when developers accept feedback, they can achieve some incredible stuff. And honestly, there might be no Paradox Warfare system I enjoy more than Wiki 3's now, at least for this time period. I think Paradox absolutely deserves the scrutiny for shipping games in states where they desperately need patches just minutes after launch. But the Paradox curse is something different, and it's something they've paradoxically brought upon themselves by not managing to port all or most of the old mechanics into the newer games, making the new seem less feature-rich than they might actually be for a total newcomer. At the same time, some members of the community seem to not understand the difficulties associated with that process, and they're unable to judge the new game based on their own merits. And combined, that's indeed a shame, one I hope both Paradox and the community can learn from. And luckily, it does look like we are. But what do you think? Do you have any hopes that Paradox and their recent approach to early dev diaries will make a big difference for totally not EU5? And how do you feel about games like CK3, Imperator, or Victoria 3 after Paradox have stuck around with both free and paid updates? Let me know in the comments, and please remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!